Hello and welcome to Kilmainham Gaol for our virtual queer history tour. My name is Brian Crowley. I'm the Curator of Collections here in the museum, and today we'll be exploring Kilmainham's LGBTQ history. Now, just before we begin, a few caveats. First of all, this is a reduced tour, so there are many aspects of Kilmainham's queer history that we won't be touching on this tour. If you want to hear all about those other stories, maybe you'll be able to join us here in person when we start running these tours again, when things get back to normal. The other thing to bear in mind in general when talking about queer history is we're talking about a period when it wasn't possible for most people to be open about their sexuality. In the 19th and for much of the 20th century, it was nearly impossible for people to identify as being LGBTQ. They would have faced huge social ostracization if there was any suggestion that they were anything other than heterosexual. And in many cases you'll find that not only could people not admit their identity to their friends and family, they couldn't often admit it to themselves either. So when we look at this history, it's I suppose a speculative history, and on this tour you'll find that I probably have more questions than answers. And it's important to remember, particularly when I'm talking about historical figures, that practically none of them ever openly identified as being LGBTQ. So I suppose with those caveats in mind, if you want to join me, we'll head into the jail and explore its really fascinating queer history. So first of all, a warning. On this tour we're going to be talking about sexual acts. A lot of the criminalisation of gay men in particular centred around particular sexual acts, so on occasion we'll have to be quite explicit. So I suppose we've given the warning now for younger years. Because, as I said, the legislation a lot of the time centred around specific acts between men. And the legislation begins actually quite a long time ago, back in the 1530s. And for nearly 300 years, the main law and legislation used to prosecute gay men was based on the Sodomy Act of the 1530s. This act came about as a result of the Reformation, when Henry VIII absorbed a lot of the areas that had previously been under the jurisdiction of church courts into the civil realm, and that included the prosecution of people for acts of sodomy, or buggery as it was also referred to, what we would describe today as anal sex. Interestingly, at that time it was a non-gendered crime. So if you look at the prison registers for Kilmainham Gaol, you'll get examples of men who are prosecuted for committing acts of sodomy with other men, but you'll also get heterosexual couples, men and women, who are also arrested under the Sodomy Act. It was a very hard crime to prove, because essentially it was an act that was usually committed in private, and if it was consensual, both parties were equally culpable and were both equally liable to be prosecuted under the law. So interestingly, in looking for examples of gay men who were prosecuted and imprisoned in Kilmainham Gaol, I've actually found relatively few cases, certainly less than 50. Things got a lot more difficult for gay men in particular in 1885 with the Criminal Law Amendment Act, and there was an amendment to that amendment which was known as the Labouchere Amendment, and that effectively criminalised any sexual activity between two men. There's an apocryphal story that there was no mention of lesbianism under that act, because nobody wanted to explain to Queen Victoria what a lesbian was, and they felt that she mightn't believe that lesbians existed. Unfortunately, it turns out that is just a story. But in many ways, I suppose it reflects the fact that for a lot of that period in the 19th and 20th century, society almost refused to acknowledge the existence of lesbianism. And while in some ways it meant that lesbian women were free from the fear of prosecution, it also means that lesbian lives are much more invisible in the records than the lives of gay men, because in order to punish homosexuality, they at least had to name it in places like Kilmainham And we'll head now into the main part of the building and hear a bit more about the individual cases of men who were prosecuted and imprisoned here for their homosexuality. So if you just want to come with me. So this is the east wing of Kilmainham Gaol. It's actually the most modern part of the prison, and in many ways it represents the pinnacle of Victorian prison architecture. And its appearance owes a lot to a combination of lots of different factors, including ideas around religious reform, ideas of prison reform, also advances in industrial design and technology, and also, I suppose, the desire of the establishment to control the unruly masses. It was specifically designed to implement what was referred to as the separate system of prison discipline. That meant that prisoners spent most of their time on their own in their cells. In many cases, they only really came together to go to the chapel for prayers or religious services, or to go outside to do their exercise. In some cases, you also had prisoners who were sentenced to hard labour, so they would also have had maybe more opportunities to see their fellow prisoners. The other thing about the design is it's built as a panopticon, as an all-seeing eye. It was very easy for the guards to see all of the cells at the same time, and you'll notice in the doors that each door has a little spy hole, and the guards would check the prisoners at least once every hour, and they had strips of carpet along the edge of the hall so the prisoners inside their cells couldn't hear the guards as they approached. The idea was that, like the eye of God, the eye of the prison guard was always upon them. And you can see that very heavy religious aspect to the operation of the prison, certainly at the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria. The religious reformers, their hope was that in the silence of their cell, the prisoners would think about their evil deeds. They would contemplate what they had learned from the prison chaplain and hopefully see the error of their ways, so that when they left the jail, they would become good, honest, productive members of society. Prisons like Kilmainham were seen as machines for the reformation of souls, and every aspect of the prison was heavily regulated, and the workings of the jail were meticulously recorded. So, for example, on the 26th of October 1865, we know exactly how many blankets were in use in Kilmainham Gaol, how many caps they had, how many petticoats. We know that prisoners had gaslight between 5 and 7 p.m. We know the arrangements for the night watch, what they were to do if one of the prisoners became sick in the middle of the night. We know there were 63 men and 33 women here. We know how many prisoners were sick that year. We know how many prisoners died. And we know all this because every year the Inspector Generals of Irish prisons produced an annual report on every prison in the country. There were 2 Inspector Generals, and between 1850 and 1868, one of those Inspector Generals was James Corry Connellan, a barrister at law. However, in 1868, he had to leave his position very quickly because stories of his homosexuality were about to be made public. So he retired from his position as Inspector General, he took his pension and he fled the jurisdiction. So now we're going to head into one of the cells and hear a little bit more about what it was like to be a prisoner in Kilmainham Gaol. As the 19th century progressed, that religious belief that prisons could reform and change prisoners began to wane. However, the people who ran prisons kept a lot of the regulations of the separate system in place because they found that the isolation of prisoners and the regulation of every aspect of their lives was very useful in controlling them and in some cases breaking their spirits. By the time the Irish writer Oscar Wilde found himself in prison in 1894 as a result of his homosexual activity, the main function of the prison system seems to have been to humiliate and punish prisoners. Oscar Wilde used these experiences in his great poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, and as well as being a great work of literature, it's also a really powerful social document about what it was like to be a prisoner. And it's quite rare because most prisoners were very poor, they had very little education, and nobody was particularly interested in what their experience had been. So as a result, the Ballad in Reading Jail is one of the most important things that you could probably read to try and, I suppose, experience what it was like to be a prisoner in the Victorian system. So now I'm going to read two stanzas from the poem where you get a sense of, I suppose, that isolation and also that sense of shame. With midnight always in one's heart and twilight in one's cell, we turn the crank or tear the rope, each in his separate hell. And the silence is more awful far than the sound of a brazen bell. And never a human voice comes near to speak a gentle word, and the eye that watches through the door is pitiless and hard. And by all forgot we rot and rot, with soul and body marred. Homosexual crimes tended to be underreported in the newspapers, so often we are reliant on the prison registers for details of these crimes. And there is an interesting one in 1903. That year, in May, the Channel Squadron of the British Navy paid a visit to Dublin and anchored in Kingstown, now Dún Laoghaire. In July of that year, two sailors from the HMS Jupiter, one of the ships in that squadron, are listed as being imprisoned in Kilmainham Gaol on charges of sodomy. The two sailors were Ernest J. Ansom, who was from Hull, who was 18, and another 18-year-old, Thomas James Lockie, who was from Somerset. Ernest was sentenced to 3 years penal servitude. Thomas James was sentenced to 2, and they served out their prison sentences in what is now Portlaoise Prison. Interestingly, there's nothing about this case in the newspapers at the time. However, one case that was reported in the Kildare Observer in March of 1889 was the story of John Bradley. John was arrested for vagrancy wandering near Wellington Road and was brought here to Kilmainham Gaol, which at the time was an all-male prison. It had become an all-male prison in 1881. It would seem that John Bradley got very nervous and anxious when asked to prepare for a bath. And finally, after a long discussion with the wardens here, revealed that John Bradley had actually been born, Jane Bradley had been born a girl. They go on then to explain their story to the prison authorities. Apparently they were born in Naas but grew up just off Francis Street in the Liberties in Dublin and had attended the Christian Brothers Boys' School as John Bradley. They had no memory of their father and were raised by their mother, who was a laundress. However, she had died a few months ago, but John Bradley continued to live as a man and said that they didn't care to change. According to the newspaper report, John then was transferred as Jane Bradley to Grange Gorman Women's Prison, and it concludes by saying that the prisoner was seen to be ill at ease and uncomfortable in female dress. Now, as I said at the start of the tour, queer history is necessarily speculative, and this story, I suppose, raises more questions than it answers. I suppose nowadays we wonder, was John Bradley a transgender man? Again, it's not clear exactly what was happening. Was it the idea of John Bradley's mother that John should live as a man? Or was it something that John requested and then decided, I suppose, to blame on his mother to prevent further inquiries by the authorities? I suppose what we can say about this story is that it's definitely a really interesting case of gender nonconformity and something certainly that intrigues and certainly, I suppose, would ask us to research more about these really interesting stories that often get hidden in the past. Between 1881 and 1882, Charles Stewart Parnell was a prisoner in Kilmainham Gaol, and this is one of the rooms that he occupied. He was joined in the jail by a large number of his followers from the Irish Land League and the Irish Home Rule Party, including William O'Brien, who was the editor of his newspaper, The United Ireland. The United Ireland was fiercely critical of the British administration in Ireland, And in return, the British establishment tried to destroy and suppress the newspaper. In 1883, they decided to publish a story about James Ellis French, who was the Director of Detectives of the Royal Irish Constabulary. Rumours were circulating that French was himself a homosexual and had been engaged in a number of affairs with other men. In the article, they accused him of being a homosexual by linking his name with that of James Corry Connellan, the former Inspector General of Irish Prisons, who had to leave his post so dramatically in 1868. When they published this newspaper, the British authorities then tried to pressurise French into suing the United Ireland for libel. They hoped that if they won the case, it would destroy the newspaper, as they wouldn't be able to pay out the damages. However, French was, I suppose, thrown into something of a nervous breakdown by the threat that his homosexuality was about to be exposed. In the meantime, William O'Brien had hired a detective, a disgraced detective from Scotland Yard with the very Dickensian name of John Michael John. Michael John came here to Dublin, and when investigating French, he managed to actually expose a whole network of gay men living and operating in Dublin, including Gustavus Cornwall, who was the secretary for the General Post Office of Ireland and in charge of the Irish postal system. William O'Brien was faced with a choice whether to withdraw from this fight or to double down, and he decided to double down and published an article not only accusing French of being homosexual but also suggesting that Gustavus Cornwall was also gay. This led to pressure shifting onto Cornwall, who decided that he would pursue a libel case, but as we'll see, it was to have disastrous consequences for Cornwall and the rest of his life. Gustavus Cornwall's libel trial against William O'Brien and the United Ireland newspaper came to trial on the 2nd of July 1884. John Michael John, the detective hired by the United Ireland and William O'Brien, had done a very thorough job and had managed to find three former friends of Cornwall who he was able to pressurise into giving testimony against him. One of these was a clerk called George Taylor, and he recounted a story of going to the Botanic Gardens on St. Stephen's Day 1881 with Gustavus Cornwall and Martin Kirwan, and he said that improper sexual acts had taken place in one of the hothouses of the gardens. While they were there, they met another young man, Malcolm Johnston. Johnston testified against Cornwall as well, and he also mentioned a trip to the Botanic Gardens, this time on Whit Monday. Another person to testify against Cornwall was a former lover, Alfred McKernan, whom he had first met at a musical evening. And a lot of the men who were dragged into the scandal apparently had an interest in musical to such an extent that for years afterwards, referring to somebody as being musical became a euphemism for being homosexual in Dublin. With this damning testimony, Cornwall lost his libel trial, and this led to huge celebrations in nationalist Ireland. It was seen as a victory for Irish purity over a decadent and degenerate British administration. Following his defeat in his libel trial, Cornwall and James Ellis French were arrested and sent to Kilmainham Gaol, and were joined by 6 other men who were also exposed as a result of the testimony delivered at the trial. They included 2 army officers, Captain Martin Kirwan and Surgeon Major Albert de Fernandez, and a clerk named Johnston Little. James Pillar was a 63-year-old grandfather and was charged with buggery and accused of allowing his wine and grocery business at 56 Rathmines Road to be used as a rendezvous for people of depraved habits. Also charged were 2 poor older men, Robert Fowler of Golden Lane and Daniel Considine, resident in Great Ship Street. Considine had been an entertainer and used to impersonate women on the stage and on occasion for small parties in Dublin Castle. They were both accused of allowing their tenement homes to be used by gay men for immoral purposes. These trials further exposed the men's sexual activities and inadvertently gave a glimpse into an underground world of gay dinner parties, musical evenings and drag balls in the late 19th century. The outcome of the trial for these men was mixed. French was found guilty, albeit for the lesser charge of conspiracy to commit buggery, and was sentenced to 2 years and eventually ended up in a psychiatric hospital. Fowler and Considine were given 2 years hard labour, while the biggest casualty was James Pillar, who pled guilty due to a crisis of conscience and was sentenced to 20 years penal servitude following his guilty plea. Charges were dropped against Little, and de Fernandez was told that he could leave the court without a stain on his character. While Cornwall and Kirwan were found not guilty, the result of the trial and the revelations about their private life destroyed their careers and made them social pariahs. Just up above me is where many of the leaders of the 1916 Rising spent the last night before their execution. Among the other prisoners in the jail at the time were Dr. Kathleen Lynn and Madeleine French-Mullen. These two women met each other through their involvement in the Irish socialist movement. They were both members of the Irish Citizens' Army and had fought together in the 1916 Rising. When they came to Kilmainham, they were placed in a cell together with their friend Helena Maloney, and Madeleine French-Mullen recorded in her diary that she decided that as long as she was together with the doctor, then everything would be okay. Later they were separated and Dr. Lynn ended up in Mountjoy jail, and she said she would give £10,000 to be back in Kilmainham with Madeleine. The two women had shared a home together since 1915, and in 1919 they founded St Ultan's Children's Hospital together, which provided medical care for the poor children of Dublin. They spent their entire lives together and were completely devoted to each other. However, they never identified as being lesbian or bisexual, and we don't know the intimate details of their relationship. In many ways, stories of women of that period are necessarily speculative. It wasn't unusual for women to share their lives together, but there seems to be something special about this relationship between these two women, and what is beyond doubt is their emotional commitment to one another. In 1991, Kilmainham Gaol hosted a very significant Irish contemporary art exhibition called In a State. It had been organised to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the 1916 Rising and featured many important up-and-coming Irish artists. Among them was Louise Walsh, and Louise took her inspiration for her piece, which was entitled In-Law Outlaw, from the serpents carved above the main entrance to the jail. Her piece was designed to condemn the Irish government at the time because homosexuality was still criminalised under the Irish legal system. In fact, it was to remain illegal up until 1993. So today, although we've been talking about queer history and about events that took place in the past, it's important to remember that legislation which criminalised homosexuality in Ireland is still in place in up to 73 other countries around the world. And in 12 of those countries, you can be put to death for committing a sexual act with another person of the same sex. So as is Pride Week, we must remember that what is for us the past is the current situation for many of our queer brothers and sisters around the world. So we've come to the end of our tour. Thank you for joining me, and hopefully we'll see you in Kilmainham Gaol soon.